Hello, this is part two of my 2008 video about 2008 stock market crash. And the thing I wanted to bring up was, the house values went up when they were giving away this money. The government and the banks got together with George W. Bush. Now, what's the one thing Republicans really can't do? I mean, there's pretty much nothing they can't do. But there is one thing they can't do. What's that? Raise taxes. They cannot raise taxes because it just goes against their whole belief system, their whole philosophy. They want to cut taxes. They don't want to raise taxes. And that's all a bunch of horse shit. They want to raise taxes. But they don't want to raise taxes where it says in the paper, taxes are going up because of George W. Bush. Now, George Sr. Bush raised taxes and was not reelected. And he promised not to raise taxes, and he did it anyway, and he was not reelected because of it. So Junior wasn't going to make the same mistake. And Junior had 2 terms, didn't he? So, and most of this 2008 stuff happened in his 2nd term. So he went to bed with the banks. He told the banks, you do this, and they knew the market was going to crash. That's why they bought the credit default swaps. They knew they had insurance policies. Why? Because they knew they were going to crash the market. They were crashing the market on purpose. They were stressing it out. And that's why they do those bank stressors now, to see if the banks can handle the stress tests that they put the banks through to see if they can handle it. Yeah, it's a bunch of horse shit. And they do it because that's what they were doing before 2008. They were stressing out the banks, and 2008 happened because they couldn't handle the stress. And they knew it, and they did it on purpose. But I want to get to the point of why they did it on purpose and why George Bush got into bed with the banks. It was to raise taxes. That's the only reason you had the crash of 2008. Because what happens when a house that goes for $400,000 and only increases about $5,000 a year in price? Look, the house property taxes and a lot of the taxes are tied to the price of your home, or the estimated value of your home. So when you sell your home, that price is the value of your home, whatever price you got for it, because that's what the market was willing to pay for your home. So your taxes go to that level. Now, if you do it on a country basis, and you give out free money, and you have a frenzy on people buying houses and driving up the prices from $400,000 to $600,000-$700,000, and I don't even want to talk about like mansions and millionaire houses, what happened to those prices. But what happens? Your property taxes all went up. Everybody got a tax increase that the Republicans can't do, but did through this scheme with the banks. All right. So what do the banks do? The banks love it too, because what do you pay more of when your mortgage is $700,000 and not $400,000? You pay a lot more interest. So the banks made money too. And like I said, if you don't pay back the mortgage, they have the house and they have the credit default swap insurance, which AIG should have but didn't go out of business for. And the money went into the house, so the people put a better bathroom or a better kitchen, and now you got a more valuable house. So they didn't care if you don't pay it back. Well, you couldn't afford to pay it back. That's why they were giving a $500,000-$600,000 mortgage to a guy that worked at McDonald's. They didn't care if he could pay it back. They wanted to raise the value of the house, to raise the tax base. And what do they always talk about with home taxes and property taxes? Reassessment, right? They always go for reassessment. Well, there's no point in reassessment if your neighbor just sold his house for $700,000 because that's the value of your house for the most part, give or take. But your house was 400,000. Well, it's no longer 400,000 anymore. If your neighbor sells his house for 700, so and it's the same house. So you see what I'm saying? And if you don't think they were in cahoots and they didn't do this on purpose, you don't know our government too well. Our government is a bunch of snakes. They're bastards. And like I said, the one thing Republicans can't do is raise taxes. But they figured out how to. It didn't go in the paper that George Bush raised taxes. It went in the paper that house values have gone up. And everybody ran out to get their house reassessed so they can get a lower tax. That was just a bunch of bullshit. A bunch of accountants made a lot of money on doing the reassessment, and it was all crap. And what did Obama do the minute he came in? And everybody bought new cars too. They got the $500,000, $600,000 mortgage. They bought a new car, and they put it on the mortgage over their home equity, So as collateral. So what happened when the 08 happened? The GM, the car manufacturers were going out of business. Nobody can afford a car because everybody was broke from what happened in 2008. So what did they do? Now, they didn't like that guy driving his 20-year-old Buick that barely, except for basic repairs, didn't have any repairs on it, because back then they built cars like cars to last. Now they build crap and sell it for $100,000. And it only lasts for 2-3 years, and you got to throw it away. So what did they do? They got all those 20-year cars off the road. Obama did his credit swap, his own credit swap. Turn in your car and we'll give you a credit towards a new car. But you had to buy a new car, and you had to turn in your old car. And, people got good deals on that, because they got a few $1,000s for a 20-year-old Buick that they would never have gotten anyway. But, so they thought they were getting a deal. I mean, that's a scam the government was pulling. They were giving you a deal. It wasn't a deal. I mean, for some people it was, but other people it wasn't. It got them into a mortgage, which the banks made money on. And now what happens? You bought that 20-year Buick for maybe 10 grand. A new car in 2008 or 2009 was about $30,000, $25,000. So, yeah, the interest on that, and GM and all them have their own finance companies, which are ran through banks. And it's all a banking situation. And it's all about interest. And they were making money. And what do you pay on interest? You pay taxes, so the taxes went up. And what else went up? Your insurance bill went up, because now you have a new car. So you have to pay more money for insurance. So, and he screwed the mechanics, because mechanics made a living with that 20-year-old Buick, and now they roll up the roads, so the mechanics had nothing to fix. And a lot of mechanics went out of business because of that. But GM survived. The billionaire, trillionaire company, they survived. The little guy, Afongo. So, that's the scheme. That was the scam that was done to this country and the world, because credit default swaps and mortgages was a world thing. It was international. They screwed a lot of governments, local governments, little governments, with this credit that they couldn't afford. And guess what they're doing now? They're blowing our government to get what they want, because our government is putting the screws to them, because they owe us money. And if they don't want to go belly, if they don't want to lose, they have to do what we want. They have to instill the programs that we want. And again, it's all a scam. It's all a scam to screw everybody. But the United States government came off looking good. Like, we saved the car industry. We saved the banks. Remember, they bailed out the banks with taxpayer money. And they got higher taxes. Everybody's house in every country, every state went up. I don't know there was any house that didn't go up in value because of what happened in 2008. So their taxes all, I don't know any state that doesn't charge property tax. And they all went up. And what happened when they went up? You had to get a higher salary to pay that higher mortgage. So your income tax went up because you're higher, you're at a higher rate, and you're paying more. You're paying more in taxes. So all across the board, it was a tax increase that the Republicans made. And then what happened? They blamed the Democrats. It's Obama's fault. Obama didn't do nothing. I mean, he was part of it. He knew what was going on. And that's why he was able to fix it. It wasn't a surprise. None of it was a surprise. It was a surprise to us because we didn't know what the banks were doing. But the government knew what the banks were doing. The government has the SEC, well, not even the SEC, but the banking regulators and all that. They knew. They knew what was going on. So, and you know, when you got these mortgages, people bought stock. So it drove up the stock market. People were putting their money in the stock market thinking they could pay their interest, pay their mortgage with the stocks, the money they made in the stock. And 2008, what happened? It all came tumbling down. And people lost in the stock market. They lost their mortgage. They lost their jobs. They lost their cars. And again, the bank didn't lose the car. The car was still there. You can't pay it, but we repossess it and we auction it off and we get the car. And you get screwed. And what do they do? The houses, the car, the stocks. What do they do with all that? They're manipulating everything. It's a scam. But what do they do with all that? They blame you. It's your fault. You were stupid. You shouldn't have took out that mortgage if you couldn't afford it. You shouldn't have bought that car if you couldn't afford it. You shouldn't have bought that stock if you couldn't afford it. Your fault. Well, to a degree they're right. But it was their fault because they were setting you up. They were making sure they won and you lost. And you lost 100%. And they didn't lose anything. They got higher values on all these houses that aren't worth what they are now. They aren't worth it. And they know it. And the ones that got screwed the most were the little old ladies and the little old men that retired and thought they would live in their paid-off house and just cover the taxes. But now the taxes doubled. So they had to sell and get the fuck out. But everybody got screwed except the government and the banks.